All right, let's talk about paying for these wars. Okay, so now, just to give you this idea of how does this really change things, um, wars are going to be way more expensive now. You got to pay for more people, you've got to pay for them longer, and again, the size of armies are going to increase. Guns are way more expensive than swords. Cannon are more expensive than a bunch of horses. All of a sudden, it's just becoming this huge, huge cost. If you're going to fight a war, if you're going to be a ruler who's able to fight and win wars, you are going to put a lot of money on the line, way more money than before. And I don't just mean like it's a little bit more expensive, I mean exponentially more expensive. This is Charles V. We've met him twice before. Once, when we talked about Erasmus, Erasmus was his tutor when he was a kid. The second time we met him is when we talked about Martin Luther, and he's the guy who was the head of the Holy Roman Empire who said, Martin Luther, I don't like what you're doing, we're going to shut you down. Didn't really work, but that's the idea. He inherits Netherlands, Burgundy, and Spain. So if you look at our map down here, the red is Spain. I know this doesn't look like Spain over here, but Spain was in control of these areas. And this area right here, that's all Spain. And then he inherits Burgundy, right there, and the Netherlands. Great. So now he's got a whole chunk of change out there. That's fantastic. And then at some point, he's elected the Holy Roman Emperor. There was an election that was done. So he's elected Holy Roman Emperor. So now he's in control of everything that's colored in on this map. Now here's the deal, right? If you are in France or England or one of these places or one of these places, how do you feel about him? Like, you don't feel that strong because now he basically controls everything. And like France, for example, is going to start to feel very surrounded at this point, if you can sort of see why that's the case. So there's going to be a lot of pushback against him. And so there's going to be war. And war is not like a rare thing at this point. Wars are going to happen. And they're going to happen on, I guess you could say, European scale. It's not just sort of a war here or a war there. It's going to be on a larger scale because if you're fighting against the empire here, you're technically also fighting against Spain. And so there's a lot more to this. So let's ask and answer a simple question. I'm not going to do the history thing. You guys read about that in the textbook about like which wars were fought when and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not going to really ask you all that stuff just so you sort of get the general timeline. What I'm more concerned about right now is how can a ruler pay for war? War is super expensive. How are they going to pull this off? And I want you to think about in each of the sort of ways that rulers find to pay for war, what problems come with each of the following things. So let's just start with an easy one. The easiest way to pay for your war is to win. If you win the war, then you get to claim the new territory, and then you can say to this guy over here, in exchange for your service, you're going to get this land, or that you can pay soldiers by giving them land or plunder or payments or things like that. This is fantastic. And you can even get the country that you conquer to keep paying you money over and over every year as a sort of a tribute. And that's even better. Like, then you can keep paying this stuff off. So that's one way to do that. It's a risky way, because if you don't win the war, then everything collapses. But still, that can work. If you win the war, that can help pay for the war. Second way you can do this is going to be taxes. Just get money from people who've got money. This is going to require approvals of councils. Now, this is going to sound weird. Why would a king need to get the council to approve? Because a lot of the money is in the hands of what we would call today kind of the middle class, people who live in the urban areas, who are traders and merchants and things like that. And then the other place you're going to find the money is the nobility. And both of them have enough organization that they say, yes, you can ask for money, and if we approve it, then you can have it. Because you are definitely, we are saying to you, we need you to protect us, ruler. You're the only guy that can really pull this off. But we're not just going to give you a blank check and say whatever you want to do. So what happens is what develops are these things called, what we think about today as like parliaments or councils. So in Britain, it was Parliament. There's the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and essentially the king would say, guys, I got to pay for this war. Will you guys authorize a tax? And they would say, yeah, okay, you can have a tax. Or they would say, nah, figure something else out. Don't fight a war or whatever. Now, the king wasn't always sort of constrained by this, but it was hard to get taxes if the parliaments weren't on board. In France, it was called the Estates General. In Spain, it was called the Cortes, no relation to the other Cortes who went over to the Americas. But, so most of these states had this. The ruler had to sort of go through the more powerful, rich or the more powerful nobles to make sure you sort of get this signed off on. All right, that's great. But again, this is also a chancy thing because you might not know this, but people don't like to pay taxes usually. And so it was always a hard thing to sort of get done. By the 1600s, England's actually going to have a king that's going to say, I demand more taxes. And the Parliament's going to say no. And then the king says, well, then you guys can't meet anymore. I don't want you guys to meet anymore. And eventually they cut the king's head off. I mean, it gets messy. So, great. That's another way. But it's a chancy way. How else can a ruler pay for war? This is a good one. Confiscate church land. So you got these countries that have Protestant rulers now, but they have left over from earlier days. They have monasteries and they have churches, these Catholic churches, and they got all these riches that they gathered over hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, Catholic Church, it's out now. It's a Protestant. This is a Protestant land, and so the king might say, you know what? That monastery, we're going to grab, that's our stuff now. And they'll confiscate those lands. That works great, but it only works for Protestants because Catholic rulers can't just claim a monastery because then you go to hell. And that works great, but it also, there's only so much Catholic stuff that you can grab. And that gets grabbed up. In the Protestant lands, it gets grabbed up quick. Like Henry VIII is the guy that starts the Protestant Reformation in England. And before Henry VIII is out of power, but by the time he dies, all the Catholic stuff is gone. So you can't go to this well very often. Another thing you can do is sell titles. We call this venality. It's essentially, you got these rich people in these cities, and they kind of look at the nobles and say, the nobles have it going on. I kind of want to be like that, right? It's, everybody kind of wants to emulate the rich. And so they say, they buy titles from the king. And the king's happy to sell these things. They don't cost him anything. Like, okay, you're a duke now. Congratulations, give me money. The problem is that if you do that too often, then it's no longer cool to be a duke, which makes this less likely of a thing. So you got to control this a little bit. But it's another way to sell, to get money. Another way, this is a good one. You're going to like this one. Debase coinage. All right, so let's take a look over here at this. This is not economics class. We're just going to work with this for a second. Here, you got this coin, and it's made out of metal. Like our coins we have today are not made out of the metal that is like a quarter is not worth a quarter if I melt it down. But the idea here is there's enough gold or copper or silver or bronze or whatever this is made out of. There's enough of that in here equivalent to the cost of this coin. So you could take this coin and essentially you have that much value in silver, or you have that much value in copper. So somebody has to measure this very carefully. And so you have these things called mints that sort of press these out and say, we've weighed, we've measured this. This thing right here is equivalent to 1x of copper or whatever. And so when I give this money to somebody else, they know, they don't have to measure it or weigh it or anything like that. They know this copper is worth 1 copper. Fantastic. Great. But what you could do if you're the king is you could just, cheat a little bit and say this is worth it's worth 1 copper. I don't know why I'm coming up with this. It's worth 1 copper, but the amount of metal in there is maybe 0.95 of a copper. And so now I have 0.05, which is essentially now my money. Or you could see, kind of clipping off a little bit of this, and now you start gathering up that extra. That's what we call debasing coinage. What we also call that has sort of implications even today. We call these things like inflation and like that. But don't worry about that. The point is that you can do that. The downside, though, is then people don't trust your money anymore, and that can cause some economic problems. In the short term, you're getting the extra money. In the long term, you're undermining the economy itself. And then you can borrow. And we're going to talk about borrowing here in just a second, because this becomes one of the main ways it's done. Is you go to we're just starting to get these sort of not just national banks, but actually individual banks, like international banks, you could say. But not only that, you have just people who have lots of money. And they're willing to give you this money if you promise that you will give that money back with interest. The sort of rules about usury and that God says you can't loan money with interest, that's a Middle Ages thing. That's no longer the case anymore. Capitalism has shown up. And so this becomes a way, if I have a lot of money, to make a lot more money if I just lend that money, just like you banks would do. We're going to talk about that here in a second. All right. I know, you're loving this economic stuff, I can tell. So just hang on. It's going to get even more economic-y. Because what about, okay, so you might say, okay, great. So Charles is looking for ways to make money. But I remember from junior high that Spain went over there to the Americas. They basically captured all of it. And then they started pulling silver and gold out of the Americas. And just tons of silver and gold coming back. Big old ships weighed down with silver and gold coming back to Spain. So I don't know why Charles has to worry about money. He's got money floating in all the time from the Americas. That's free money. Just pay for your stuff out of that. So what about all that? Turns out this was not so great for Charles. And you're sitting there going, I do not understand this. If I start getting tons of money in the mail, this is good for me. I can go buy a car and do whatever I want to. Why is this a problem? Here's why it's a problem for Charles. And it's one of those weird economic sort of paradoxes, okay? First of all, the flow is uncertain. You didn't know how much money you were getting. This was not like Publishers Clearinghouse where they send you $7,000 every week for the rest of your life. This was some years you get a lot in, some years you don't get a lot in, some years pirates take those ships and you don't get anything in. So you can't count on this money. The flow is uncertain. Then you had to pay for the protection of it to get the money over here, or the gold and silver over here. You had to pay for the administration. You basically had to be like the whole New World. The Spanish control of the Americas was not cheap. So this was not just free money coming over. This was a huge investment. And that had to be paid for. And that could get, again, progressively more expensive as you go along. You're not just sort of control of mines and bringing them back. You're controlling the entire population. And then this becomes the bigger problem. As the gold shows up, as the silver shows up, all of a sudden, all the gold and silver in Europe is worth a little bit less. We call that inflation. So let me just walk you through this for a second. For those of you guys who don't know how economics works, and do not know how economics works either, but I'm just going to give you a little idea here. All right, so let's say we all have dollar bills, okay? A dollar bill is worth $1. This is great. And I can go to the store and I can buy $1 worth of stuff. This is fantastic. So then, let's say that tomorrow the United States prints $1 billion more and just throws them out there and says, here's $1 billion more. Now, this $1 bill that I have, because there are now more $1 bills in circulation, this $1 bill is not worth as much as it was the day before, because there's more dollars out there. You don't need my dollar that much, so it's just valued a little bit less. This is what we call inflation, because now all of a sudden the prices start to go up, because if there's more money, if I have more money, then I'm willing to spend more to get this particular thing, and prices start going up. Inflation, because the value of each dollar starts to go down. This presents a real problem. I'm not going to go into this, why that's a problem economically, but just trust me, it's a problem. And what you end up with, just magic, in the 16th century, because of all this gold and silver coming over, in Europe you get what's called the price revolution, where prices that had been relatively stable for hundreds of years start to creep up. The cost of bread starts to creep up, which is fine, by the way, if you're one of those people getting more money, but the average person doesn't have that. The average person has the same amount of money they've always had, and now bread's getting more expensive, and now this is getting more expensive, and all of a sudden this is becoming a real problem. The winners in this whole thing are going to be the Dutch. The Dutch, the Netherlands, they're going to they're going to be a new global power as a result of this because they're the traders. They get to sort of profit from all of this extra money out there. I won't explain why. Just know that the Netherlands makes out like a bandit in the 16th century. By the end of the 16th century, the Netherlands are one of the major global powers. Who are the losers? Spain. Here's why. Okay, so now there's more money in Spain. I know this is economics, just hang with me here. More money in Spain. So here's the deal. If there's all this extra money in Spain, what do I do? So let me do this with you for just a second. So let's say that you grow a lot of your own food, okay? You're a farmer or something like that. And then all of a sudden you get a whole bunch more money that's just dropped into your lap. All of a sudden you realize, man, I could grow my own food, but it'd be a lot cheaper. It'd be cheaper if cheaper and easier, honestly, because now that I have this extra money, I'm just going to take this extra money and I'm going to go buy food rather than grow my own food. I just save tons of time. It's not that expensive because I got tons of money just sitting around. And so I'm just going to go buy food. And if I'm buying food, I have no need to grow my own food anymore. That's great. But this is going to be true now for Spain as well. It's just cheaper to import stuff rather than make it yourself. And over the next 100 years, throughout the course of the 1500s and 1600s, you just don't get domestic industries. There's one of the major industries in Spain at this point is going to be shepherding, sheep. Because there's just you're not making stuff because it's cheaper to buy stuff somewhere else. So when the gold and silver starts to dry up, you don't have the industry anymore. So like for yourself, once that outside bit of money that stops coming in, you've forgotten how to farm. Or your kids are now grown up and they've taken over and they don't know how to farm because they've never done it before. And so now they are essentially screwed. And that's kind of what happens to Spain, is they're essentially screwed. They don't have these domestic industries anymore to build upon. They're starting from ground zero, essentially. The other losers are going to be the land-owning nobility. By the way, I should just point out, both these things, you can see both these things if you've ever read the book Don Quixote. It is taking place sort of after all this happens. And it's the poorness of the area, and the land-owning nobility really loses a lot of its power. And that's that further centralization of the power there as well. All right, great. So that money's out. So that's great. That's Charles. Sorry, I know it's going to be a longer video, but I only have 2 more slides, and then we'll take a break. This is Philip II right here. Philip is Charles's kid. So Charles dies, and Philip inherits all of his stuff. Now, what he doesn't inherit the Holy Roman Empire, because that's an election thing. So once Charles dies, they have a new election. They actually elect Charles's brother, who's over on that side, which kind of splits up the empire a little bit. So he doesn't have as much stuff that he's responsible for anymore. However, in 1580, he's the next in line to Portugal. Now, we didn't really talk about this much, but something happens in 1490 something. I don't know what it is. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas, which I know is one of your terms. And essentially what happens is the Portuguese and the Spain are out there exploring the world. And rather than the Spanish and the Portuguese constantly fighting all over the world, they decided, let's go to the Pope, and the Pope will just divide things up. Whoops. So the Pope basically draws a line and says, this side is going to be Spain, this side is going to be Portugal. Have fun. I just divided the world. There you go. Okay, that's great. So out there in the world, there's a Spanish Empire and there's a Portuguese Empire. 1580, both of those things end up in the hands of Philip. And so now, basically, get rid of that, because now it's all kind of Spain. So while he doesn't have sort of the dominance that his dad had in Europe, the dominance around the world is pretty out of control. The problem is that is just as expensive, and he's facing the same problems that his dad does, is that it's just going to be expensive to do this. War has continued to get more expensive. Again, I don't mean just a little more expensive, but in Philip's day compared to Charles's day, hugely more expensive. By Louis XIV's day in the 1600s, way more expensive. I mean, this is crazy. you have to have these large permanent armies now. You don't send them home. You have them all the time, which means you've got to feed them, you got to house them, you got to clothe them, you got to train them. It is enormously expensive to be a state anymore. So what did Philip do? Philip borrowed money. He borrowed lots of money. He ended up going bankrupt 3 times. There were a lot of people in Europe that had extra money, and they were willing to take a risk, and it was a dumb risk. He ruined a lot of money lenders as a result. A lot of prominent money lenders were ruined because Philip said, I'm sorry, I know I said I was going to pay you back, but I'm not going to pay you back. And one of the things that was the big problem here is if you don't pay your troops, so you've got these people that you've basically given guns to and all sorts of other things, trained them how to fight, and then you didn't give them their money, they're going to have a problem with that. And mutinies becomes sort of a big thing in this era. But one of the things, now this becomes the trick here. So what's the big deal? Just Philip will turn around and borrow money again the next time. But I just want you to think about this. Let's say you go to somebody and say, I want to borrow some money. They give you money, and you say, I'm not going to pay you back. Screw you. They collapse, no problem. You go to a different person. You say, I want to borrow some money. They say, can I check your credit? You say, sure, go ahead. Oh, your credit's not very good. So we'll still give you money, but you're going to have to pay it back. Instead of at a 5% interest, you got to pay it back on a 10% interest. No problem. You do that, you say, I can't pay you back. Screw you. They collapse. So then you go to another person. They say, can I check your credit? Sure. And they say, wow, you really have a problem with bankruptcy here. So I'll give you the money, but you got to pay me a 50% interest. And the king says, sure, no problem. This is one of the problems, is that how can you ever trust a king? The king can always just say, I'm not going to pay you back. What are you going to do? I'm a king. So it keeps becoming more and more expensive to borrow on worse and worse terms. Terms that essentially start to bankrupt Spain. Like on the one hand, yes, Philip says, I'm not going to pay you back. So the next money lender says, okay, I'll give you the money, but I get this and this cut of all of your proceeds from this. And so it just becomes way too expensive to borrow money, but there's no other way to get the money. And so it just basically does this. And all this together, the stuff we talked about on the last slide with the sort of exhaustion of, not the exhaustion, with the collapse of the economy and the inability to sort of have an economy that can grow out of that. This overspending just to try and stay afloat because of the expense of the wars. All this exhausts Spain. And by the 17th century or the 1600s, we kind of stopped talking about Spain. Spain was the global power in the 1500s, and by the middle of the 1600s, it is a backwater on the edge of Europe. It has control over all these places in the world, the Americas and all this, and again, it's just not much by then because it just sort of exhausts itself, I guess is the way to phrase that.